on Sunday. Props and ops. Sitting pretty on a Monday. Props and ops. You know it's betting and beer with props and ops and props and ops.
Welcome to Between the Lines, a show where we explore the biggest NFL line moves by the books that take the biggest bets. Between the Lines, part of the Props and Hops family, as well as the Hammer Betting Network. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined once again by the co-host of the show and the star of the show, if we're being honest, Fabian Sommer, also known as Suma. Suma, week 2, annually known as overreaction week in the NFL. I'm wondering if it might be time to pump the brakes on that title, given the market we're seeing unfold thus far.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like 5 or 6 years ago, we would have seen some different lines this week, I would assume. For example, let's just take the San Francisco 49ers, for example. Last week, they looked absolutely horrible in a rain game against Chicago, which was arguably the worst team going to week 1. And the Seahawks upset the Broncos on Monday Night Football in front of 90 million viewers. And I would say that 5 years ago, the 49ers would not have opened at like minus 9.5 favorites the week after. So I think what we are seeing is that especially the early market is becoming a little bit sharper, and books who throw out opening lines on like Sunday night, like classic overnight lines, are also not over adjusting nowadays, I would say. 5 years ago, week 2 was the classic. Let's bet on let's bet against some overreactions. Let's bet on some underreactions, and I think that is a little bit compressed nowadays.
Yeah, we'll explore some line moves and see if we can uncover potentially a bit of betting value moving forward, even if there aren't those classic overreactions to pounce on. But before we get to this week's games, want to let everybody know this episode is sponsored by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. Valuable, concise, and entertaining. These are Dr. Ed Fang's 3 goals with each correspondence, which mostly covers the NFL and college football. Ed is a friend, a fellow fan of craft beer and the old-fashioned, and also a data scientist whose work has informed my betting. So you can check out the newsletter at thepowerrank.com and join me as a subscriber. Now, Suma, last week before we got to the games, we had some hops on hand. Got to admit, I don't have anything handy this week. It is Wednesday morning as we record this in Los Angeles for me. But let's say this, if the Chargers can somehow pull out a win at Kansas City tomorrow night, I would be happy to rejoin you in a virtual toast with a German-inspired beer next week. Does that sound like a fair deal?
That's a very, very fair deal.
All right, we might have some long odds if we're going to see that happen, because we'll talk about Chargers Chiefs right out of the gates here, and the Chiefs have seen some steam. This line opened -3. Kansas City got up as high as -4.5. I think some books were even as high as 5 at a certain point. Now it seems to be settling in at -4. A lot of reason to be bullish on Kansas City after week 1, and perhaps a bit of reason for the market to fade the Chargers a touch. Keenan Allen looking like a no-go for this one. On the other side of the ball, J.C. Jackson's status up in the air. And if we just look at the stats versus the scoreboard for the Chargers in week 1, +3 in turnovers, +6 in sacks, yet they were hanging on for dear life at the end of that game. And Suma, when it comes to Joe Lombardi babying Justin Herbert and the Chargers offense, I thought you had a great line in your NFL week 1 takeaways article at thehammer.bet, basically referring to Joe Lombardi's offensive scheme as malpractice.
Yeah, so what was really mind-boggling in that game is, like, we have talked all season long last season about how the Chargers have to maximize Justin Herbert's strength a little bit more, getting better on early downs, throwing the ball more downfield, because they were basically running the Drew Brees offense from the Saints 2017 to 2020, with some more deep passing sprinkled in because it's just Justin Herbert. And Herbert, I mean, they tried to pound the ball on early downs, even though it hasn't been working. So many short passes again. Justin Herbert had to bail them out on some really good pressure situations from the Raiders front. And all in all, I just don't have the impression that the Chargers coaching staff is really trying to maximize Justin Herbert for whatever reason. And I think that might play a role in the Chiefs getting bet up. I mean, the look ahead for the game was KC -3. Then we had the Keenan Allen injury. We had the Chiefs looking absolutely awesome. Then we had the Chargers almost blowing that lead to the Raiders. And then we had some soft openers at -3, and they didn't survive like a couple of minutes. It got immediately bet up. Keenan Allen was already priced in because when you leave the game with a hamstring injury and you cannot return back, it's probably like 90% plus that you're not going to start next Thursday. So that was always priced in. And I think right now, when we are looking at the -4, -4.5 range for KC right now, Penny -4, Circa Las Vegas -4, I think that's a pretty solid range right now.
And while there is some reason to fade the Chargers for a few things we've touched on, as well as to back the Chiefs, that offense looking great without Tyreek Hill, as you forecasted, I also want to run one more factor by you for this game. Kickers were pivotal in week 1 across the league. On the positive side, the Browns winning at the wire on a 58-yard field goal. Similarly, the Steelers getting out of Cincinnati with a win with a 53-yarder at the gun. On the negative side, the Bengals, who lost to Pittsburgh. This isn't all on Evan McPherson with the backup long snapper. The whole operation was kind of thrown off, but the Bengals missed a game-winning PAT at the end of regulation, as well as a chip shot field goal in overtime. The Colts missing a game winner in overtime. The Titans missing a game winner in regulation. It just seemed like kicking games really swung a lot of outcomes at the wire in week 1. And Harrison Butker, a pretty good kicker for the Chiefs, injured early in that week 1 game. His status is in doubt for Thursday night against the Chargers. What do you assign when it comes to the impact of an injury to the Chiefs kicker for this one?
So first of all, while you were telling all those kicking situations from the weekend, I had to think about Rob Pizzola's favorite phrase: "We wager actual dollars on this game." Harrison Butker. Yeah, I think Butker got just ruled out before we started this show, so he's going to be out. To be honest, if all, I would probably adjust the Chiefs a little bit upwards because of that, because I think Butker has been a really good kicker for them in recent years. And without him, I would assume that maybe on some of these 4th and short situations, Andy Reid might rather go for it instead of trusting his kicker. So that might possibly. So if I had to adjust this number because of Harrison Butker, I would probably bump the Chiefs a little bit up rather than down.
That factor might support one of my signature bets over the years with props and hops. And we'll let the audience read between the lines a little bit. This won't be too tough to connect, but shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards has been a frequent favorite of mine. And if the Chiefs can extend some drives, turning 4th and 2 at the 35, let's say, into a drive that gets them in a goal-to-go situation, that could bode pretty well for that type of prop. So something for bettors to consider on Thursday night. Moving on to Sunday, Suma, let's talk Washington at Detroit. This one's seen some interesting activity looking at both the side and the total. Starting with the side, the Lions had been bet up to as high as -2.5. That has since come down a bit. It opened at Detroit -1. What do you think of that move when we've seen Detroit play very well from behind the last couple of years, but I believe this is their first time in about a year and a half in the favorite role?
Yeah, exactly. I saw a tweet today. I think it's been 24 games for the Lions to not be favored or not have been favored anymore. So pretty amazing streak, to be honest. They opened -1, got bet up to -2.5. That's not a very strong move because we were not touching the 3 by any stretch in this game. And then we saw some buyback for Washington at +2.5. Today, there was a really wild injury report for the Lions stating that I think 3 or 4 offensive starters on their O-line were not practicing, like Taylor Decker, Frank Regno, and I also think Jonah Jackson, the left guard. They have already lost a right guard whose first name I cannot pronounce it. It's his last name is Vaitai. So we don't know whether those guys are going to play, but they were DNP today, and the Lions have already signed an offensive lineman from the Steelers practice squad to their active roster, I guess. So that's usually a sign that something's going on. So at this point, I would rather expect the line move towards Pick'em instead of a -3 for the Lions. At this point, I would also not be surprised if we saw the Commanders closing as favorites if those injury reports continue to be pretty bad for the Lions. And you already mentioned the total quite a bit. And that opened at 46.5 early Monday morning. Then there was a release. I've heard that it was Warren Sharp, or AKA Tyler Brickner, whatever his real name seems to be. And he released the over, I think, 46.5 on Monday morning, and then it skyrocketed up to 49 and even 50 in some places. And now we saw some decent buyback of the 50. We're currently looking at 48.5 at Circa, and a 49.5 heavily juiced at Pinnacle. And with those injury reports limping around the Lions facility right now, I also would not expect. I would not be surprised if we saw a lot more under money as the week goes on, if those injury reports hold true.
Before we move on from this game, Washington is one of my favorite teaser candidates on the board this week. And based on what you said about foreseeing Washington possibly closing as the favorite, maybe that 24-game underdog for Detroit, that 24-game streak, not safe yet. It could extend to 25 if you're correct there. In the spirit of trying to see both sides of the coin, is there anything that might give you some pause if you're a teaser bettor giving a long, hard look at Washington right now?
No, I think taking the Commanders right now at like 7.5 or 8. I mean, we have a soft 2 on the board with Pinnacle. Pinnacle usually protects their teaser, so you won't get it there. But if you're able to scoop up any 7.5 or 8, I think it's a pretty solid teaser leg, because you are basically asking the Detroit Lions to win by more than 8 points in any given football game. So that's a lot to ask, and therefore I really would be on board with that teaser leg for sure.
There we go. Well, moving on to the next game we'll break down. It's been hovering in and out of teaser territory over the course of the week thus far. That would be Tampa Bay at New Orleans, and we can talk side and total for this one as well. When we look at this side, Tampa Bay currently -2.5, or some expensive -3s out there at some point earlier in the week. This one opened 2, so we've seen a lot of movement. What's your point of view on the line for Bucs Saints right now?
Yeah, that opened at a 2, got bet all the way up to almost 3.5. We were really, really close from the 3.5 on the New Orleans Saints. I think it was Chris -3, -20. Pinnacle was also very close. And then all of a sudden, I think it was Tuesday, 8 p.m. in the evening, my time, so 2 p.m. New York time, where someone, I don't know who that was, completely blasted the New Orleans Saints across the screen. Almost down to 2.5. We are currently looking at Bucks +3 EV at Chris, +3 +04 at Pinnacle, and Circa is even gone down to a 2.5 for the Buccaneers right now. And pretty interesting line move, because some people on Sunday, you can already probably set your alarm clocks to it, because someone will say, oh, books got crushed around the 3, because some people took the, let's say, -2.5 with the Bucks, some took the +3.5 with the New Orleans Saints, or a very good +3. But that is not really true, or that's a myth, because the guys who took, let's say, the -2.5 early with the Bucks, and let's say the +3 at very good money for the Saints at Tuesday morning or Tuesday noon, they bet into rather lower limits at some sportsbooks. So as the season progresses, we are going to see limits raising a lot. And at some point, that early split around the 3 will not really matter to all those market making books anymore. So that pretty much doesn't matter whether they got some action early around the key number of 3. I'm really interested to see where that line will ultimately settle, because we are seeing some injury issues for the Bucks, who lost their left tackle Donovan Smith. They lost Chris Godwin. At this point, it doesn't look like Chris Godwin is going to play this week. Donovan Smith was DNP today with his elbow injury, and Todd Bowles said that his elbow injury is going to be a pain tolerance thing. So if Donovan Smith feels good on, let's say, Saturday or Sunday morning, he might end up playing. And that's a injury to monitor, because I think Donovan Smith will have some impact on the line, because the Bucs are going to face the Saints defensive line, which is pretty good. And we already saw what the Cowboys did in the red zone with Micah Parsons off the edge. And I would guess that for some bettors, that might be something to monitor.
And it's something to monitor, not just for the point spread, but for the total as well. You talked about how some books, maybe more of a myth, but the narrative prevailing that if this one lands Tampa Bay -3, oh, the books got middled, they got crushed. Similarly with the total, we talked some key numbers last week. It's currently at 44, opened 47.5. So if this one is 24-21 Tampa Bay, people might think the books got crushed on the side as well as the total. If we look at this power move on the under, on one hand, I totally get it. Dennis Allen and that Saints defense have really imposed their will on Tom Brady and his time in Tampa Bay. You touched on the Bucs injuries along the offensive line as well as to Godwin. But I also think that the Saints defense looked a little bit softer than what many of us probably expected in week one. I know you had the over for Saints Falcons, so you were probably quite happy to see that. But with perhaps a softer than expected Saints defense, and then Tampa Bay on Sunday night in Dallas really settling for a lot of field goals. If they can convert some of those drives into touchdowns, I think we have a much higher ceiling for their scoring output. All things considered, what are your thoughts on, again, this power move down from 47.5 all the way to that key number of 44?
I gotta say, I completely get behind that. I completely get behind the move. I'm not saying that I like the under at the current pricing, but I can logically understand the move, because the Bucs offense struggled once the Cowboys were able to apply pressure. They lost Chris Godwin. They could potentially have some injuries along their offensive line. The Saints always played them tough in recent years. So the Saints probably, let's call it, have their number or something. And I think this week, it's a completely different matchup for the Saints defense, because last week they didn't really know what they would be getting from the Falcons. Marcus Mariota, or let's say Arthur Smith, had a very great day calling that offensive scheme for Marcus Mariota. He really killed the Saints with his legs time and time again. And I think that would be a completely different matchup, because this week the Saints defense are going to get Tom Brady, who cannot move away from the pocket at all. They can keep him in the pocket and try to disguise anything behind it and not have to care about the quarterback's mobility. So this is going to be a different matchup, in my opinion. And on the other side, the Saints offensive line looked at times really shaky against a Falcons pass rush that was supposed to be like a bottom 3 unit. So I think bettors took the under all the way down to, we are currently looking at 44.5 across the board. Really think that this could rather be a matchup where the defenses have an advantage over the opposing offenses.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on to the late window on Sunday and talk Seattle, San Francisco. The side currently, San Francisco laying 9.5. We've seen some buyback after a release pushed it up as high as 10 across the board yesterday. And I want to touch on this, not because there's been a ton of movement around key numbers, but the look ahead for this one was San Francisco -9. And I know that look ahead lines can be soft, lower limits, not available for very long. So over the course of the season, there's not a whole lot of merit to them from a handicapping standpoint. But look aheads for week 1 and week 2 were available for much of the offseason. So that San Francisco -9 was much more accessible to a lot of bettors. And then we saw San Francisco go up as high as a touchdown favorite, losing outright in Chicago. Seattle as high as a touchdown underdog, winning outright on Monday night. I understand we need to take both of those results with a hefty grain of salt. But even with that considered, I'm thinking this is a game that, yeah, a few years ago, maybe it's Niners -7, -7.5. When we're seeing it reopen where it did and still going the other way in San Francisco's favor, I've just got to ask Suma, how did this number possibly go up after what we saw in week 1?
Yeah, sorry. I think that when you ignore week 1 for a moment and not care about the result that happened in Chicago, I think that Seattle was one of the worst teams, or rated as the worst teams in the league. And the San Francisco 49ers were rated as a borderline top 10 team in the marketplace. They're playing at home. Seattle is coming off that Monday night football game, short week. it was probably from an emotional standpoint their personal Super Bowl this season against Russell Wilson. I mean, that place was absolutely rocking. I mean, I was watching the game real life in Game Pass the other morning, and sometimes I could not understand what Joe Buck and Troy Aikman were really saying when the Broncos were on third down or something. So that was pretty nuts. So yeah, I mean, Seattle, despite winning against the Broncos, didn't really look all that great. And I don't think that when you crunch the data, you want to include the offensive performance from the 49ers into your data set from last week because it was so crazily raining. And I mean, there were some throws early in the game from both quarterbacks where you really could see how the ball was slipping through their hands. So I don't really know that you should incorporate all the data from week one for the 49ers. And yeah, going to this week, I mean, it may be hard for some bettors to get to a 10, but on the other side, it also looked like a really good matchup for the Niners going into week one. So yeah, I can understand why the number would be high. If bettors think it's too high, they will likely grab the 10 with Seattle at some point. But yeah, like we said before, it's pretty crazy that we arrived at that number in the first place.
Do you think there's any chance that San Francisco minus 10s appear again if somebody missed the first crack at the Seahawks plus the 10?
Probably, yeah. We're currently looking pretty much at 9.5 across the board. So someone took some 10s, I think, yesterday. Yeah, I could definitely see that. I mean, the Seahawks will also be without Jamal Adams, and the media narrative was always pretty negative about Jamal Adams. But last season, sometimes the Seahawks were able to plug him into a certain role, and especially in week one, I think he was also playing much closer to the line of scrimmage. So depending on how they used him, he would mean a little bit more to the point spread. Yeah, I mean, the 49ers really are the superior team over Seattle, and I think if someone believes that Trey Lance can be good, and what we saw in week one doesn't really matter a lot, they might happily take the 9.5 at some point again.
Got it. Well, let's go from a game that hadn't seen a ton of movement, but a lot of intrigue with that Seahawks 49ers point spread and matchup to a game that has been adjusted significantly when we're talking Cincinnati, Dallas. This one opened Bengals laying 6.5 or 7, but even if that seemed like a pretty hefty adjustment already for Dak Prescott's absence, that number didn't last long. Already bet up to minus 8-ish, some 7.5s out there. What do you make of the move on the Bengals against the Cowboys this week?
Yeah, I think it's very important to note that, and some people on Twitter might say, oh, it's a really big adjustment for a quarterback like Dak Prescott, who wasn't playing well last week or whatever. But we are not really just talking about the downgrade from Dak Prescott to Cooper Rush. We also have a lot of confounding factors because Cooper Rush is going to play behind a below average offensive line. So like last year or even 2 years ago, when the Cowboys had to plug in a backup quarterback, they still had a very good offensive line. They had Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup. So that's really a completely different starting point right now. So I would argue that without Dak Prescott, the Cowboys are on paper looking like one of the worst offenses in the league potentially. Their defense has lost Jaron Kearse. I think Kearse has the green dot and is calling plays. So, I mean, we are really not just looking at a quarterback downgrade, but we are looking on a team downgrade in general. Also, Connor McGovern, or I don't think it's Connor. I probably are mixing up the name with someone from the Jets right now. But I mean, Cooper Rush is not going to play in a great with a great supporting cast. So that's something that you have to downgrade even more as a confounder. And then I can totally understand why bettors would like the Bengals at a touchdown or even a little bit more, because the Bengals looked kind of bad against the Steelers last week, but they also almost won that game despite turning the ball over 5 times. So, yeah, I mean, since he's clearly the superior team against Dallas, and I can understand why bettors would grab the -7, -7.5, -8 with the Bengals here.
Yeah, there's no sugarcoating it. Week 1 was disastrous in Dallas, and they've got some company. If we want to look at a team involved in this next game, we'll break down. Arizona got absolutely pummeled by the Chiefs, and they will be traveling to Las Vegas in week 2 to take on the Raiders. The side currently Raiders -5.5. It got as high as 6, and this one opened as low as 3. So we've seen substantial movement here. Suma, do you think that movement has been warranted?
I think it is. It was a big group that released Las Vegas -3.5 on Tuesday, which blasted the entire screen from left to right, and I think it even hit -6 in some places. I can understand it, even though I would say that at +6, and we already saw that some bettors might come back on the Cardinals because it's really a big number. I mean, last week we talked about that bettors might come back on the Cardinals against the Chiefs at +6. And this week we are talking about the Raiders, which is a completely different category than what the Chiefs showed last week. Yeah, the Cardinals are still dealing with some injuries. Their cornerback chart is pretty thin. Their safety, Jalen Thompson, is dealing with an injury. J.J. Watt has not practiced all last week. Wendell Moore might still be out this week. So yeah, I mean, the Cardinals don't look like a good team right now, and I think that's what those bettors who grab the -3.5s with the Raiders are thinking as well, which makes that move probably logical. But I would also expect that as soon as it moves towards 6 again, we will likely see some buyback.
It seemed like right on cue as we started talking about this game, I saw one offshore market maker on my odds screen tick down to Raiders -5. So if anything, this line might be trending a bit back down versus hitting 6 once again. But I did want to ask you, maybe a good thought exercise for the audience here. When we're seeing lines that could be 5.5 at certain books, 6 at other books. I know we talk a lot about 3 and 7 as key numbers in the NFL. In the last couple of years, I've heard more about the 6 as a semi-key number. What value do you assign to what a 6 is worth relative to, let's say, a +5.5?
Yeah, the 6 is absolutely a lot more worth than the 5.5. I mean, anything from 3.5 to 5.5 does not have a lot of value. The 4 has gotten some slightly more value because of the extra points and 2 points conversion, stuff like that. But in general, 5.5 is nothing compared to nothing, relatively speaking, in terms to the compared to the 6. I mean, the 6 comes into play in overtime because you cannot kick an extra point if you score a touchdown on your first possession. So overtime touchdowns are usually like 6 on the final scoring margin, and also with the, let's say, analytics revolution, with more coaches willing to go for a 2-point conversion when they cut the opposing lead down to 7, or in this situation down to 8, and then they have to decide whether they kick the extra point or whether they go for 2. It's generally smarter to go for 2. That's what we have also seen a little bit more in the past. So from that viewpoint, the 6 has gotten, let's say, a tiny bit more value in general.
All right, score one for the analytics nerds, the 6, seeing a bit more value these days than it has in the past. Moving on to the next game, the Sunday nighter, Chicago, Green Bay. This one opened Packers -8, Packers -9 at some shops, and a couple of simultaneous releases brought this one up to -10. And I find this interesting because, again, we saw Chicago as high as a touchdown underdog, yet they won outright. Green Bay as a short underdog had a really ugly loss. In your Monday column at thehammer.bet, you said that the cheeseheads looked like Swiss cheese on both sides. So with that in mind, I'm wondering what you think of this spread going up, despite what we saw out of these teams respectively in week 1.
And that again, like 5 years ago, we might have seen a -7.5 for Green Bay and maybe some more early Chicago money. But this time, no one is really buying the let's say, performance of the Green Bay Packers that was like on their bottom range of potential outcomes, versus the Chicago Bears upsetting the Niners in a crazy monsoon. Um, I mean, when you look at that game from Chicago against the 49ers, I mean, Justin Fields, he won the game in the end, kind of, but he also had only like a handful of great plays. So it was not like the Chicago defense was offense was moving the ball all game. And now they're going to go to Lambeau Field, which is a completely different matchup once again. But it's also interesting to note, because we will also talk about the total, which has plummeted down to 42 and a half, that there is some rain in the forecast. So we are potentially looking for another rain game for Chicago. It's not a crazy forecast. It might also easily shift until Sunday, but that's definitely something to note and might play a role in some people grabbing the under here. Um, yeah, I mean, Green Bay has entered the season as one of the top NFC teams. Chicago has entered the season as one of the worst teams in the entire league. So pre-week one, that number was probably somewhere in the -9, -10 range on the look ahead line. And it's very tough to over adjust your ratings for the Chicago Bears based off that last game. And I mean, in week one, the Packers, they looked horrible, but they were also without two starting offensive linemen, without their quote unquote best wide receiver. Their defense has a lot of brain farts against Justin Jefferson. So there is a realistic chance that we are going to see a completely different Packers team this week. And that's what bettors who took the -9s off the board probably thought.
When you touched on the total a moment ago, you partially answered my question. As you noted, it's down to the 42 and a half range. It was as high as 44 and a half. So I was wondering initially why this might not have moved the other way. Sounds like weather, part of that answer. But if we look at the conditions in Chicago, got to say the offense is not as bad as they looked. And conversely, the defense is not as good as they looked. And then for the Packers, the offense can't look much worse this week than their 7-point output against the Vikings. So, aside from the weather, is there anything else that you think explains a pretty strong move to the under?
No, I think in general, the Bears look to have a very bad offense, and the Packers on paper have one of the better defenses in the league. Even though we saw like this highlight reel of Justin Jefferson in week one, that doesn't change the fact that the Packers are pretty talented on defense. They have a pretty decent pass rush against a bad Chicago Bears offensive line. That offensive line looked a lot better in week one, but I want to see it on a decent sample size before I start upgrading them in my notes, at least. And yeah, so when you combine the Bears have a very low prior on offense, and the Packers looked bad on offense last week, and we don't know whether they are getting Elton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari back. I think that's potentially an angle for the under.
All right, well, let's turn the page from Sunday night to Monday night, the second game of this week's Monday night doubleheader. I think we're bookending the breakdowns this week with the two games of the week, from Chargers Chiefs on Thursday to Vikings Eagles late Monday night. And we'll talk about the side here. Currently, Eagles -2, some 2.5s out there. This one did open on the key number of 3, and that was a cheap -3 for Philadelphia. It got as low as -1.5 on some buyback. Now it's settling somewhere in the middle. The Vikings squarely in teaser territory for those looking to cross up through 3 and 7. Sumo, with a little bit of ping pong with this point spread early in the week, what's your point of view on where the number currently sits and where it goes from here?
Yeah, so I think this is a really, really interesting matchup, because we are seeing the market battling about how to rate both of these teams. I mean, there's some uncertainty with both of those teams going into the season, because how good can Jalen Hurts be? The Eagles potentially have one of the best, or they have one of the best rosters in the NFL. They might have one of the maybe the best outside of quarterback. But it was always the question, like, how good can Jalen Hurts be? What's his ceiling, and how good does he really have to be in order for the Eagles to have a very, very high floor. And with the Vikings, we knew that they were talented. They have some holes on defense, but they had an upgraded offensive line, new coach, Justin Jefferson could be one of the best receivers in the league after this season. He already is, to be honest. But there was also some uncertainty, like how this whole scheme with Kevin O'Connell is going to work out. And in week one, both teams looked really, really good. They both looked like clear-cut NFC playoff contenders. And now we are going to battle about, in my opinion, whether the Eagles deserve the money to push this towards a -3 at home on prime time. And that's the battle that I'm expecting to see as we move on further into the week. I would be absolutely surprised if we saw the Eagles as a dog at some point. I just don't think that they deserve this. They deserve to be favored, but it's going to be interesting whether they deserve to be favored by a field goal, or let's say by a soft field goal at home.
Plenty for us to keep in mind over these next few days as we approach the action for week 2. But for now, that's about all we can do. So as we start to wrap things up, I want to share a friendly programming reminder to everybody. Bet the lines as part of the Props and Hops family. You can catch Between the Lines, on our YouTube channel for Props and Hops, as well as our podcast feed for Props and Hops. When in doubt, you can find all of our content over at thehammer.bet. And speaking of content across the Hammer, Fabian on Primetime with Rob Pizzola doing Sunday Night Football pregame and halftime shows from a betting point of view. Also Mondays, a great write-up, that article posted early for all of us in the U.S. to wake up to. Top takeaways from Suma from the Sunday slate that was. And Suma, I know you are 9 hours ahead of me. So if I'm doing the math right, that means Sunday Night Football kicks off a little after 2 a.m. Suma Standard Time. And then in addition to the pregame show, you've got the halftime show, you've got the article. With the season approaching full swing now, when are you sleeping these days?
I actually slept a lot on Monday and Tuesday. To be honest, I have not watched Monday Night Football live. That was not worth it.
Didn't miss anything interesting.
I mean, waking up to that Nathaniel Hackett decision was absolutely great content in the morning. But yeah, I mean, the halftime show with Rob was around 4 a.m. in the morning, and I think in the middle of the third quarter, I was already sleeping. And then I got like 3 hours of sleep until my son woke me up, and then I got to work. But you have to go through it, and I can sleep on a Monday and Tuesday, so no issue there.
Fair enough. Whatever it takes to keep you sharp and cranking out the impressive volume of really high quality work that you're doing. Love to be part of it with you here at the Hammer. And I want to remind everybody they can also catch the Props and Hops flagship show on Fridays throughout the season. We'll do deep dives on the props with Pro Better Hitman. Looking to build on a winning week 1 for the show thanks solely to Hitman's clean sweep, going 3-0 on his props. You can look out for Props and Hops on Friday, right around 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. And of course, last but not least, you can follow The Hammer on Twitter at The Hammer HQ. Also check out all of our content at thehammer.bet. And with that, want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you right back here on Friday to talk some props with Hitman.
Props and hops and props and